We are ready now to listen to the words of the Holy Gospel, the good news of Jesus for us. Please stand and join me in the Gospel acclamation.
When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a scholar of the Lord, tested him by asking, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Every day when we read the newspaper, which I love to do, and watch the news at night, always do it if I'm home, we are bombarded with issues related to the law, primarily people breaking the law. When we go about our business every day, we are constantly reminded about the law with stoplights and stop signs and one-way signs and the North Greenbush police lurking behind the bushes, ready to pick up a speeder or someone who slides through a stop sign. There must be a fascination with the law among American people because you can watch some form of law and order every day at every hour. Well, things haven't changed all that much. During the time of Jesus, the Pharisees spent night and day discussing and debating the law. And any Jew worth his salt knew those laws, and this includes Jesus, inside and out. Did you know that at the time of Jesus, the Jews had 613 laws that explained to them how they were to love God? A third of those laws told them what they should do to love God, and 2/3 of the 613 told them what not to do. They could barely make a move or dine without recalling several laws to make sure that they were doing the right thing. And so it shouldn't surprise us when we listen to today's Holy Gospel and the Pharisees once again try to trip up Jesus. And they say to him, "Master, which of our laws are the greatest?" And they step back. And Jesus answered immediately and said, what is very familiar to us now, "These two laws are the greatest of all the 613 laws. And actually, all the rest of the laws are summarized in these two." And he said to them, "Love God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind." How many of you remember that from the Baltimore Catechism? Ooh, look at all those hands go up. You're all old people. And secondly, love your neighbor as yourself. I'm sure the Pharisees were kind of taken aback Because once again, they're trying to put Jesus in a situation, put him in a corner where he wouldn't have an appropriate answer. And think about it, my friends. Isn't this what our lives should be all about? Totally. Loving God and loving our neighbor. That's who we are as believers in the Lord Jesus Christ. Our entire life should be about loving God and loving neighbor. And as you know, here at St. Michael's, we offer you so many opportunities to reach out to our neighbor and to lift the burdens off the backs of those who have so much less than we do. This is who we are at St. Michael's. Now I want to share with you a story. It's a little bit long, but it kind of emphasizes the importance of these two laws, or two great commandments as we refer to it. And the story goes like this. Long ago, in a far-off town, there were no such things as books and paper. And so, whenever a story was told, a story that the townspeople wanted to remember, the builders built a house, and they inscribed this story on planks of wood, and they put these planks of wood up in the rooms of the house. And so, the size of the room would depend upon the length of the chapter, and the size of the house would depend on the number of chapters. Every story had their own house. Now, the biggest fear for the people in this town was fire. Because if a fire broke out and burned any of these homes down, these houses down, then that story, which had been imagined by some writer, would be lost forever. And so because of that, the firefighters were trained hard. They were very swift and very courageous. And so it happened. There was a big storm, and lightning struck 3 of the houses, and they started to burn. And the firemen were called, and the first fireman to arrived at the door of the house of the Bible. Now, the house of the Bible was the most important house ever built in this village. And it was the house that people came from near and far to visit and to read. And the house of the Bible was almost totally engulfed in the flames. And the fireman ran into the building, and he ran up the stairs, and he ran into the room called the Room of Matthew. Now, in this house, there were 72 rooms, because as you know, there are 72 books in the Bible. And the fireman knew exactly where he wanted to go. He found the 22nd chapter of Matthew, and he pulled off 2 of the slats, 2 verses of Matthew. And he ran out of the house, and he was covered with ash. And the people cheered him, and they said to him, "Why did you run into the burning house? And why did you just bring out these 2 verses?" And he said, "I wanted to get these 2 verses because if the entire house burns down, we will be able to rebuild it. Because these 2 verses, love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself, summarize every other story in this house. And we will be able to rebuild the house and retell this story. Because all the stories in the house of the Bible reduced to these 2 verses. Love God and love your neighbor." Think about it. every gospel passage that we listen to every weekend basically reduces to these two verses. Love God and love your neighbor. Now, I have a few visions in my head of what it will be like when we pass on to God and we meet him at the gates. And one of my visions is this. He will say to each of us, "It is so good to see you. Sit down here and make yourself comfortable." And when we are comfortable, he will say to us, "Now tell me your story. Tell me your story in relation to love God and love your neighbor." And Jesus will say, "Because I am hoping that all the stories that you tell me will really be based on these two important commandments." So my question to you, my friends, is, are you ready to tell your story?